Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
This is me trying to make sense of the story of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I spent a number of hours trying my best to understand it as I asked myself why I was even doing it, but eventually my research came to a close. Welcome to the Dawn of Ragnarok story analysis. In our first episode, we're going to have a look at the early stages of the DLC, so spoiler alert here, with some context about the backstories of Odin, Frigg and Baldr, the lore information we could gather about the actual invasion by the North African Isu in the territory here represented as Svartalfheim, and a dedicated look at the introductory events of the expansion. We are also going to delve into the presence of Reda within the DLC and how he was able to survive the Toba Catastrophe, before moving on to discuss the magical bracer that Odin receives and the Silica material used to power the Isu Tecnology, with some connections to Assassin's Creed Origins. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's start at last. This is the first episode of our Dawn of Ragnarok analysis. So, it's the first episode, so you know how it goes. We need a bit of context first. For those of you who might not know, the recently released Dawn of Ragnarok DLC is a full story following the Isu Odin after the events of the Asgard and Jotunheim arcs of Assassin's Creed Valhalla and before the Ragnarok/Toba Catastrophe scene. As it was the case for the main game, this DLC too is fully coated in the mythological veil generated by the perception of Eivor, who is actually experiencing Odin's memories and is processing them through her own understanding of the Norse mythology and its gods. Because of this narrative device, some would say because of this excuse, this story specifically, its world, its characters, everything about it feels so very vague, and it's very rare that this DLC provides all the elements for fans to understand the actual, underlying Isu story that is happening here. The reason why the Asgard and Jotunheim arcs worked is that they had, at least in their main story, many parallels, what I call anchor points, to the actual established Isu narrative from all the other games before Valhalla, but in this case, most of the story is on its own and it very rarely ties to the established Isu lore, especially at the beginning of the story, making this feel more like a trip into mythology and magic that almost doesn't have anything to do with Assassin's Creed than an actual story about the first civilization. Nonetheless, I did try my best to salvage the actual information about the Isu meta story that the DLC still provides us with, make no mistake about it, but you'll excuse me if I'll chuck in the occasional rant here and there. Alright, all the premises are on the table, let's dive into the story. Odin's memories start when he and his wife Frigg reach Svartalfheim as they are trying to save Baldr after he has been kidnapped by the Isu Surtur, who was the leader of the army of North African and Greco-Roman Isu that had invaded the territory controlled by another group of Isu here represented as dwarves. Odin and Frigg got to Svartalfheim, whichever area this represents in the real world, through one of the so-called Asgardian gates, which are potentially maybe some huge Isu teleportation devices. Even the database is vague about whether they existed or not. We haven't even started and this is already confusing. Anyway, they get to this new Isu territory in order to find Baldr, their son who had been kidnapped by Surtur, and his army of North African Isu. Now, because the DLC is what it is, and it throws at you without any introduction characters that you have never met but are supposed to really care about, unless you take a look at the database, let's already take a step back and look at the backstory of Odin's family in order to get a better sense of who are the characters at play here. Of course, we know our best pal Odin, the leader of the Asgardian Isu, the stout Isu determined to save himself and his friends from the Toba Catastrophe no matter the cost, including deceiving an entire other Isu group or nation and stealing from them the seventh method of salvation. He was an Isu that had a lot of sons, pretty much as in the Norse mythology, and while in the Asgard and Jotunheim arcs we got to meet Thor and Heimdall, in this DLC we get the mention of another son called Vidar, who in the Norse mythology is meant to avenge his death by killing Fenrir, and of course Baldr, the son that he had with the Isu Frigg. Frigg was supposedly one of the, if not the love interest for Odin during the Isu era. They seemingly were lovers and inseparable partners in crime and always longed for adventure. One day though, Baldr was born, but apparently it was an unplanned birth, and that supposedly caused some friction between the two. This also happened during a time when the Asgardian Isu were at war with the so-called Vanir, an Isu war that was briefly mentioned in the Asgard arc as well. And, using the database words, at the time Odin did the unthinkable, that is, a selfless act. Mirroring the Norse mythology, he agreed to marry Freyja, the sister of the leader of the opposing Isu faction, which merged the two groups and brought peace, but at the cost of separating Odin from Frigg and Baldr because of this new marriage. So when Baldr came of age, she sent him to Asgard, and that was both so Odin could have him close along with Freyja acting as a stepmother, but also and especially because Frigg felt the call of adventure being a stronger need for her. Lastly, we have Baldr himself, who is described as a bright and optimistic figure in the Norse mythology and was called the pride of the Aesir. He had the gift of foresight, which means that he, like his father, was able to perform the calculations, and when he did, he once saw a calculation of his own death, which caused him to fall into depression. We also get to know a bit more about him from 6 loading screens / text documents that reference an equal number of memories when Odin was talking to Baldr in different moments of his life. In these documents we get to know how Odin told him stories about the elves, yeah, elves in Assassin's Creed, but we're going to talk about them in future videos of this analysis. He also told him stories about Sinmara and Surtur, but the most important info from these screens comes from 2 specific documents. The first where he says, "Do you think I fear fate? No, you and I, we forge our own paths, we are fate," which surely happened after Odin got the calculation about his death at the hands of Fenrir, and supposedly not so long before the Svartalfheim events, but also shows the classic dynamic of a father projecting his own expectations but also hopes over his son. Not sure how I feel about that. The other interesting but also vague information comes from another dialogue that they too had sometime before the Svartalfheim events, where Baldr was already depressed by the calculation about his own death, and Odin actually stating that Baldr was supposedly pretty much immune to death, so he shouldn't have worried. How that could actually happen to the Isu Baldr beyond the mythological veil, I can't say, but it appears that it was indeed true that Baldr could only die, or at least was calculated to die, through the use of mistletoe, as it was confirmed in the Animus Anomalies file of the main game. Now that we know a bit more about these characters, and admittedly it's still not enough to start caring about them, especially about the one that dies in the first 15 minutes of the DLC, we can go back to the events of the DLC itself and have a look at its start. So we begin with Frigg and Odin bickering with each other, because that seems an interesting way to like characters from the start, and already in this opening Frigg does seem to be a bit annoying, sometimes intentionally forgetting her own faults while criticizing Odin. Odin seems to not be too worried about Baldr at the start because he believes that nothing can hurt him, but Frigg states that one thing actually exists, and it's of course mistletoe, as we mentioned earlier. While getting closer to the former city of Eitri, both characters share the belief that Baldr was captured because of Loki, which might or might not be shown in the prequel comic Forgotten Myths, even if they don't have proof for that. And because Loki never confessed to have caused it, Odin locked him and chained him in some kind of prison, supposedly located in Asgard, never to be released again, as he had also chained Fenrir, which is also pretty much a setup, or an excuse again, if you will, for not having Loki as a character and Carlo Rota's voice in the entirety of the DLC, which was so bad, both considering the ending of the DLC and even Baldr's death, which happens off screen. Oh my. Alright, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's proceed properly. Frigg is a little obnoxious again, confronting Odin because he has forgiven Loki so many times for everything that he did, but Odin reflects on the fact that both of them brought each other pain, somehow almost understanding Loki. This is actually only the first time where Odin is mulling over his relationship with Loki and how things could have been different and still could be different, which, along with a number of other interactions in the DLC, made me change my opinion on him slightly. I do have many gripes with the DLC story, but Odin's character, at least, is not one of them. On their way, the two mull over what could have been done to prevent the invasion of the territory known as Svartalfheim by the North African Isu, and Odin says that he should have rallied Asgard's Isu troops in order to stop Surtur's armies, but the treachery wreaked by the Greco-Roman Isu spy known as the Builder, who was shown in the Asgard arc of the main game, was too fresh to convince the Asgardian Isu to go on another war after what had happened on the Bifrost Bridge, which contextualizes the events of the DLC happening not so much time after the events shown in the Asgard and Jotunheim arcs, maybe weeks or months. In the discussion, Frigg mentioned how even in the past, in what's called quote-unquote ancient history, Odin also did not stop Surtur from invading what is here called Alfheim, the realm of the elves, that, as we'll see in the future videos of this series, can be considered as a new group of Isu whose ancestry dates back to a long time prior to the events shown in here. So apparently at some point Surtur invaded their territory too and had all of them killed. Keep that in mind as it will be useful later on. The two reach the main city of this Isu territory, Eitri, if that is its real name, and find it completely destroyed and in ruins as a consequence of the invasion, and now the city acts as the main point of control for Surtur's forces. Now, we don't know much about how the invasion was carried out, but some documents throughout the game world do help us connecting some dots. For example, there are two documents showing that the Muspels arrived to Svartalfheim with their flying rocks, meaning that beyond the mythological veil, we can consider the North African Isu to have arrived through some kind of planes or helicarriers, so every time you are seeing these flying rocks or flying to them, they are actually flying vehicles that are hovering over the territory overseeing the war operations and that Odin can board, and that is why you can only find Muspel enemies in there. Moreover, these flying vehicles used by the invaders were not used as a means of transportations only, but also as terraforming systems, which made the invaded locations more suitable to the Muspel/North African Isu during their attack. Within the mythological veil, the terraformation is the lava sludge that can be found across the environment, and that of course is the natural territory for the Muspels while it damages everyone else. While beyond the mythological veil, we can imagine this to still be something to do with fire or high temperatures on the ground that was likely more suitable for the North African Isu while also damaging the invaded ones. We also know that Eitri, the biggest city in the Isu territory known as Svartalfheim, was the city that fell first during the invasion. That's where the North African Isu targeted their original assault, and that's what became the North African Isu HQ following the huge and violent attack that made the area a volcanic wasteland. But of course that's more to it than that. In fact, Eitri was a key location for Surtur's plans because of the tower that was already located there, as we'll see in our future videos. Also, it was only after conquering Eitri that the invading forces spread to the whole region, while the local Isu were hiding in the shelters. So back to our worried parents, apparently Frigg can feel Baldr's former presence in the area through some kind of mother and child bond, which isn't really explained, and thus she can pretty much follow a super long path like a bloodhound, finding all the places where he had been and had left his smell, and this leads them to the building in the town where Baldr was kidnapped, and where Odin found a document, presumably written by Loki, and addressed at the North African Isu/Muspels, which are hinted at as the recipients of the message because of the singe marks on the document. In there, the writer gives precise details as to how to kill Baldr by using mistletoe, the only thing that could kill him, at least in the Norse mythology. So yeah, this very much looks like it's Loki sending information to the North African Isu in order to kill the son of his longtime antagonist and brother, and that is also kind of confirmed by how he signs off. Of this I have no doubt, which is almost the same sentence that he angrily uttered when Odin told him there would be some reckoning for him having a son that might have led to the High One's demise. Eventually, the two get to the main building of the city, where Surtur is residing along with his wife Sinmara and with Baldr held captive. Apparently, Surtur knew that Odin would come, making it seem like he is dealing with the calculations too, so much so that later he adds that he knows that both of them won't die that day. This also hasn't been the first time that Odin and Surtur have fought, which matches one of the tales that Odin tells in the Valkyrie arena about him winning their first confrontation. So as the two fight on their own, their two wives also fight, but while Odin comes out victorious once again, that can't be said about Frigg, who is later killed in front of Odin's eyes. As the calculations told Surtur that Odin will not die that day, he denies Sinmara's wish to kill him, and as we'll see, this attempt by Sinmara to have Surtur do her bidding is not that uncommon, so next best thing they can think of, knowing that he won't die that day, is to just drop him on the bridge in front of the tower and leave him unguarded instead of taking him to a prison cell or something so that he can recover and come back at them. Very, very clever. So after a brief time spent as Eivor, that's going to be a topic for another time, we're back in Odin's breeches and we found out that that genius move by Sinmara and Surtur very surprisingly allowed two dwarves to save him. Named Sigrun and Halsin, are we calling them Isu engineers still? Probably yes, as they are described as practically superhuman in terms of ingenuity. They offer the Hugari bracer to him in order to give him a chance to in turn save them from Surtur and the Muspels. Now, what could this bracer be beyond the mythological veil? I honestly don't know. Maybe it's just me, but it delves so much into magic that I couldn't think of anything that we know of and that would allow Odin to do some similar sci-fi action in the Isu era, like drawing out the essence of fallen enemies. And as you might know, it won't even be the only artifact in the DLC that does that either. And this is just the first of so many confusing and vague magical elements that have been added to the DLC with no counterpart or at least parallel or anchor points to the actual Isu world. And in general, if we only have small hints and metaphors because the DLC doesn't care to explain and make properly understandable what is really happening, then why should we care? After giving him the bracer and a brief fight with Sinmara, Surtur's wife, the two dwarves and Odin make their way to the first shelter, and that's where they introduce him to the Sons of Ivaldi, which had already been mentioned in the Asgard arc, but they are now described more as a kind of a special operations organization that was headed by Ivaldi, the Isu/dwarf that we saw in the Asgard arc of the main game, and that after his return from Asgard oversaw the operations that created the shelters and also allowed the local Isu to resist the invasion and to then go into hiding. Once they reach the shelter, they even gift Odin with Silica, which is the material here used to upgrade the bracer and to power some of the artifacts and technology, and that some of you might remember as the same material that powered the Isu temples in Assassin's Creed Origins. So this could be a nice connection to the actual Isu, and there are some more references in the DLC as to how and why the local Isu were trying to refine the material in order to make it efficient, but all of those are again all told with the mythological coating, which doesn't really allow to get if what we see or read ever actually happened. So all in all, even the Silica material felt more like a resource for gameplay rather than an actual story element, save from a few occasions. From the various documents, we get that Silica is apparently a rare material across the world, save from Svartalfheim, and it's being used by the local Isu as some kind of battery to power artifacts and technology in general. In order to make the material more efficient, the Isu engineers built several silica refiners powered by their mills, at least that's what's shown within the mythological veil, and this refinement process quote-unquote awakened the material. The awakened, refined silica was then used as an energy source, like a battery, exactly as shown in Assassin's Creed Origins, which was something that the North African Isu were looking for in order to succeed with their own plans, and in itself this is also a little justification as to why Bayek can find the silica crystals in Origins, because at the time the North African Isu had stolen them from whichever territory was Svartalfheim and brought them home. Back to Odin reaching the first hiding spot for the local Isu during the invasion, the biggest surprise from the first shelter is of course the appearance of Reda himself. In this story, set in the Isu Era, which pretty much confirms him to be some kind of Isu character, as we already hypothesized in some of our articles, but that's not all. In fact, in here Reda seems to know a lot of what is happening around him. He knows about the Toba Catastrophe looming over the planet, he knows about Odin being able to read the calculations and have glimpses of the future, and, plot twist, he also knows how to survive the catastrophe itself, and that comes from Loki, who apparently trained and tutored Reda in... of course we don't know what. Why going into any kind of details? Better stick to the vagueness. But apparently Reda even improved whatever Loki taught him about. I'd imagine it could be something about the various methods of salvation, but this is something different. Reda seems to always be the same person across all the games and historical times he appeared in. He has memories about what happened to him, the people he met, and the stories he heard. His body size, voice, and accent are always the same, which means there are seemingly no sages involved, and thus it's probably something else entirely. So we finally got confirmation about Reda, and a story-based one at that. Wouldn't it be incredible if the most powerful and immortal Isu in Assassin's Creed was the microtransaction guy? I mean, that would be peak comedy and facepalm material right there. I love how ironic this is. More talk with the shelter's leader will grant Javi or Odin with a Hirokin/Juno name drop, but don't worry, she won't appear throughout the entire DLC, save from the post-credit scene that was even featured in the trailer, so happiness all around. And on that note, we already have to stop with our analysis or it's going to get too long. What do you guys think about the context and what we explored and analyzed in the first video of this mini-series? Do you agree or disagree with what we said? Do you think we missed out on some of the details up to this point of the story? Let us know in the comments below. Also, join us in our next video of this series where we're going to enter an ancient Isu vault with nothing inside of it and a huge lack of payoff there before moving on to another ancient vault, this time with some actual information and the new MacGuffin artifact of the DLC, the Silica, and the first pieces of information about its function and the plans that Surtur might have had for it. Thanks for watching and we'll see you in our next video.